Despite being the first ever Queen of England in her own right, Queen Mary I is remembered for all the wrong reasons. The Bloody Mary, as historians call her, was a byproduct of devastating parenting, awful politics, and perhaps a mental disorder that led her down the path which got her a worse reputation than she actually deserves. Welcome to Nutty History, and today, let's find out how Queen Mary I became Bloody Mary, the moniker that will inspire an urban ghost legend, a cocktail beverage, and arguably a nursery rhyme. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and pretty maids all in a row. Though arguably this nursery rhyme was written with Mary, Queen of Scots in mind, a few believe that the subject of this rhyme was actually Queen Mary I, for she was quite contrary to her father, half-brother, and half-sister who were ardent Protestants while Mary's faith seeped into Catholicism. All of them ended up killing hundreds of people for their faith, but it is Mary who is remembered with a tainted nickname. According to the Protestant martyrologist John Fox's best-selling work, The Acts and Monuments, better known as Fox's Book of Martyrs, Mary condemned Protestants with horrible deaths because she believed that teaching Catholicism was the right path. Her tyranny was met with incredible resistance despite hundreds of people being sent to be burned on stakes. Throughout all history, stake burning as a capital punishment was not as prevalent as it was during Queen Mary's rule. Whenever these executions took place, the air was reported to have been so thick with the smell of burning carcasses that most people could not go outside. The fortunate ones are those who would suffocate due to smoke inhalation. Queen Mary I had no mercy for women or children and ordered these executions right in the middle of her pregnancy, which made the whole affair even more twisted. Her barbarism would continue until she died in an influenza pandemic. But what made her so cruel? Well, to find that answer, we will have to begin this story from the beginning. Queen Mary I was born unwanted. She was the only living child of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. While arguably Henry VIII loved Mary as much as Catherine of Aragon did, she was still a disappointment to her father. Beautiful, graceful, and by all accounts remarkably intelligent, Mary lacked an important trait for being the eldest royal child: masculinity. The fact that she was born female meant she was openly and constantly regarded as a letdown, not merely to her royal family, but to all of England. It was his lack of a male heir that primarily incited Henry's historic series of marriages. This left Mary in a dreadful wake, fighting for her place in the royal court and family, turning her against her own half-siblings despite her showing nothing but love and affection for them initially. But before all that, she had to suffer the consequences of missing a chromosome by witnessing the train wreck that her father and mother's marriage became. Henry VIII blamed his wife for the lack of a male heir, and his infatuation with Anne Boleyn led him to divorce her mother and break with the Catholic Church. It was a messy affair. The Pope didn't grant Henry VIII a divorce at first, and in his slight, Henry VIII outlawed Catholicism altogether. He founded the Church of England and became its head as well, just to get rid of his first wife. Mary was a teenager when her father succeeded in marrying Anne Boleyn and divorced Catherine of Aragon. This gave Mary a perfect excuse to enter her rebellious teen phase. When Mary was 9, her father sent her to the border of Wales to preside, presumably in name only, over the Council of Wales and the Marches. She was given her own court, based at Ludlow Castle, and many of the royal prerogatives normally reserved for a Prince of Wales. Devise and others called her the Princess of Wales, although she was never technically invested with the title. She spent nearly 3 years in the Welsh Marches, making regular visits to her father's court, before returning permanently to the home counties around London sometime in 1528. When Mary was 14, she would often come down with sickness and irregular menstruation. She was also suffering from periods of very deep melancholy, perhaps due to the stress of simply being her father's daughter. Religion was something she found solace in, but when Henry broke with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, her fervent faith became heresy. She was born to Catholic parents in a Catholic country, but everything was changing around her all of a sudden. Soon, she found out she wasn't even a princess anymore. Henry VIII also permanently separated her from her mother, even forbidding Mary to visit Catherine's deathbed. In return, Mary retaliated by refusing to acknowledge Anne as the queen and her new sister Elizabeth as a princess, even though Mary was living with her half-sister's household at Hatfield, Hertfordshire. Anne was having none of Mary's attitude and took advantage of Henry's frustration with the behavior of his eldest daughter. Thanks to Anne's lobbying, Mary was soon deemed the illegitimate child of Henry VIII and banned from the royal court. Done with her father's tyrannical attitude, Mary dived deeper into Catholicism and refused to acknowledge Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England. The scar of this terrible relationship with her father would leave Mary with dreadful daddy issues. Anne, on the other hand, was happy to secure her daughter Elizabeth's future for now, but she wasn't faring better than Catherine of Aragon either. Elizabeth, just like Mary, was a daughter, not a son, which was the necessary prerequisite to be the heir to the throne. This jeopardized Anne's position as the queen, and she met an end worse than Catherine as Henry had her beheaded for suspicion of her having an affair and for treason while he was openly pursuing and courting Jane Seymour. Mary was once more welcomed back into the royal court as a princess after Anne's execution, but the damage to her reputation was done. She was an adult by now, and nobody considered her special anymore. She was just the king's daughter, not qualified to be the royal heir. Right after Anne's beheading, Henry VIII wasted no time marrying Jane Seymour, but the marriage lasted only a year. Pregnancy and childbirth caused immense stress on Jane's health, and postnatal complications caused her death soon after she managed to produce an heir for Henry VIII, a boy named Edward VI. Her consolation prize for being the only useful wife for Henry VIII was that she received a queen's funeral and was buried beside him in St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. That was a privilege none of Henry's other 5 wives shared. But before dying, Jane had definitely made things worse for Mary, as a male heir meant Mary's status was about to get worse in the royal court. Yet when she was alive, Jane and Mary had formed a close kinship and were on great terms with each other. In fact, it was Jane who requested to restore Mary's status in Henry's court, and she also attempted to ensure that after her children, Mary should be next in line for succession, even before she was married to Henry. However, her efforts for Mary didn't come to fruition in her lifetime, but thanks to Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th wife, Mary, along with Elizabeth, were reinstated to the succession. When Henry VIII passed away and his only surviving son Edward VI inherited the crown, he was only 9 years old. He wasn't eligible for marriage for at least 7 years, and then only England could think about the next male heir. Until then, Mary had the dibs on the line of succession thanks to Henry's dowager Catherine Parr and Edward's deceased mother Jane Seymour. For the first couple of years of Edward's short stint of 6 years as the King of England, the half-siblings had a favorable relationship, and Mary's position as Edward's successor was unquestioned. But as time went on, the previously loving relationship they had plunged into the matter of religion. Mary, for reasons both personal and political, was conservative in religion and could not be reconciled to Edward's increasingly radical Protestant stance. She hated her father for what he did to her mother using his Protestant ideology, and for that reason, she was never going to turn her back on Catholicism. Edward began to fear that if she were to inherit the crown, she would overturn all his good work and reimpose the old religion, an idea that turned out to be completely justified. So, although this was still long before he got morbidly ill, in 1552, Edward began to turn his mind to how to deny Mary the succession and find an heir of his own. From the moment Edward became disillusioned with his eldest half-sister, he began thinking about what he called his devise for the succession. From its conception to Edward's death in 1553, the little document went through several iterations, and interestingly, all of the versions excluded not only Mary, but Elizabeth as well. It is not clear why he wanted to exclude Elizabeth, despite that she had conformed willingly to his Protestant reforms. It may be that he would have determined that by logic he couldn't exclude one sister proclaimed illegitimate by the Parliament without excluding the other. Initially, the devise for the succession was crafted with the idea of dispensing with any female heirs at all. He rounded up and made a list of all potential noble maidens, and in his several Devise for the succession, listed them as preferential mothers of potential male heirs. Any noble women were good for Edward as long as it wasn't one of his half-sisters. The whole thing was a recipe for disaster. If the Devise had had legal weight and Edward had died at that point, no one could have any idea who the heir might be, as none of these imaginary sons had been born. And what would happen if one of the women less prioritized on the list had a son first, followed by a son born to the most prioritized lady on the list? Meanwhile, Edward's courtiers were looking for a suitable bride for him, and most were suggesting his cousins from either side, but Edward himself seems to have felt that he could do rather better than his cousins. He wanted to marry the princess, well-stuffed and full of jewels. Now we may infer that he meant a lady of vast possessions, rather than one who had indulged too heavily in the Christmas goose. When Edward VI found out he was dying, he was obliged to change his Devise. He may have done this completely of his own volition, or he may have been strongly influenced by the Duke of Northumberland. The Devise was changed to name Lady Jane, daughter-in-law of the Duke, and her male heirs. Edward was thus obliged to be succeeded by a woman, whether he liked it or not. The Devise for the succession was issued under letters patent, but its validity in law was very shaky. Letters patent could not overturn an act of Parliament, even though Edward had the support, with lesser or greater degrees of willingness, of his Privy Council. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed as Queen. The new Queen of England, Lady Jane Grey, was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII through his younger daughter Mary, and was a first cousin once removed of Edward VI. But despite being the first woman to inherit the throne in the history of England, 17-year-old Lady Jane Grey had never been recognized as the first Queen of England, as her reign was shorter than one could sing God Save the Queen. As soon as a proclamation of Lady Jane Grey becoming the Queen was made, the country rose in favor of the direct and true royal line and demanded that Mary should inherit the crown and the throne. As each day passed, the clamor for Henry VIII's oldest daughter to be given the crown grew louder. Soon, it had gathered an unstoppable momentum. On July 19th, just 9 days after she had been proclaimed queen, Jane was overthrown in Mary's favor. With her short reign at an end, unfortunately, Jane and her husband remained in the Tower, prisoners in the same building that had so briefly been their palace. As the country erupted into joy at the succession of Mary I, few spared a thought of poor Jane's predicament. In fact, many would have considered her fate a foregone conclusion. After all, she had, albeit unwillingly, accepted the crown in defiance of Mary, an act of high treason. Surely she would be executed. But Mary was eager to begin her reign by demonstrating clemency, and by the middle of August, she intimated to those at court that she could not be induced to consent that Jane should die. Not only was Jane her cousin, but Mary was also acutely conscious of Jane's youth and the fact that she had been manipulated. It seemed that Jane's life was safe. There was to be no such mercy for the Duke of Northumberland, and on August 22nd he was sent to the guillotine. After a few uneventful months, Mary was pressured by her supporters to at least try Lady Jane and her husband for the accusations against them, and Mary begrudgingly agreed. During the trial, Jane was accused of falsely and treacherously accepting the crown of England and acknowledging herself as Jane the Queen, thereby depriving Mary of her royal status, title, order, and power of her Kingdom of England. In doing so, she had committed high treason. Jane replied in her pleading with a single word without hesitation: guilty. This put Jane and her husband's fate directly in Queen Mary's hands, and everybody in England was expecting Lady Jane to be burned or sent to the guillotine for her confession. However, Mary remained true to her initial desire to show mercy, and it was commonly believed that Jane will not die. Mary also relaxed the terms of her imprisonment with the intention of releasing Jane Grey after some time had passed. With the matter of Mary securing the throne for herself being settled, it was time for wedding bells in the palace. Soon after ascending to the throne of England, Mary Tudor began seeking a suitable husband for herself. She promptly married Philip of Spain in the hopes of conceiving an heir. Mary would have hoped that this would put her difficult days behind her, and she and her new husband would live happily ever after. But medieval times were quite contrasting to how fairy tales depict them. A certain section of the English nobility was particularly miffed about Mary and Philip's union. In the heart of the Kent countryside, a gentleman named Sir Thomas Wyatt and several of his friends were planning a rebellion that aimed to not only protest against the Spanish marriage, but also to overthrow Mary and replace her with her half-sister, Elizabeth. Worse still, the rebels had recruited a supporter related to Lady Jane, her father. If the sins of the father-in-law were not enough to doom Lady Jane's fate, the sins of the father made sure to seal the last nail in her coffin. The whole rebellion was as good as the idea of putting Jane on the throne. Careless planning and rushed uprising fatally compromised the rebellion, and soon the Duke of Suffolk, Jane's father, and Thomas Wyatt found themselves in the Tower of London as prisoners. Jane had known nothing of the rebellion, but now its failure sealed her fate. Queen Mary was still soft on Jane, but her advisors were adamant to have Jane executed. So, on the morning of February 12, 1554, Lady Jane was executed mercilessly along with her husband, and her death made her a martyr, not just to Protestants in England, but across the continent too. Mary I certainly did not wish for Jane's execution and did everything in her power to prevent it, but now she was stained with Jane's blood. This would cast a long shadow on Mary's already depressed state of mind. Starved for love and forever seeking the approval of her father, Mary was ready to lavish all her frustrated emotions on her new husband. But sadly, this codependent pattern of her was in no way reciprocated by her 10 years younger husband. Philip fulfilled the negotiated duties expected of a royal marriage, but he was clearly not at all in love with Mary. Yet 2 months after their wedding, Mary's wish came true. She was with child, or at least that's what everybody in the palace believed. At the time, of course, there were no true forms of pregnancy testing, and propriety forbade doctors from thoroughly examining a monarch. But while her status as queen prevented physical inquiry, it also made her reproductive system a subject of public discourse. Rumors and gossip were flying among the common people of England, and everybody outside the palace was suspicious. Mary had never been beloved, at least not the way her dazzling younger sister Elizabeth was. Elizabeth was a Protestant, sharp and charismatic, whereas Mary was rigid and out of touch, and also known to be hysterical. By the time of her pregnancy, Mary's reputation was almost entirely unearned. Her age, devout Catholicism, notorious menstrual concerns, and intermittent depression all painted a nasty caricature. Amplified by constant comparison to the youthful Elizabeth, this may be how she came to be seen as the kind of woman who might fake a pregnancy and steal a child. But as she entered her second trimester, Mary took action that would cement her legacy as bloody. At the time, England was divided between Catholics and Protestants, but Mary was determined to reunite the country under the true religion by any means necessary. Shortly before Christmas in 1554, she signed an act that would incite a legendary series of executions, known as the Marian persecutions. Beginning in February 1555, an estimated 240 men and 60 women were condemned as Protestant heretics and burned at the stake. The victims of Marian persecution were popular preachers, artisans, farm laborers, or poor, ignorant folk who could not recite the Lord's Prayer or did not know what the sacraments were. She shared no mercy for those who faced disabilities. Moreover, she had a pregnant woman sent to the stake who went into labor. Mary, by now, had stopped heeding her advisors and believed it was her charge from God to bring a Catholic prince into a Catholic realm. Already a deeply devotional woman, the ardency of her faith seemed only to increase fanatically as her pregnancy advanced. She was convinced that if she failed in that duty, she would surely incur the wrath and displeasure of the Almighty. Also, Mary was hoping that these executions would scare any remaining Protestants to turn back to the old faith. This was a fatal miscalculation, as the cruelty only hardened the resolve of the Protestants and flamed the masses' anger against the Queen. Unfazed, Mary went into confinement 6 weeks before her estimated due date, surrounded by female companions and servants. While the entire nation waited for the delivery of the possible heir of the kingdom, the due date came and went, but there was no baby. Once again, all of England became a hotbed of gossip as people were speculating about the birth of a baby boy, or Mary stealing someone else's child, and that it was a stillbirth. Some were also wondering if Mary's swollen midsection was a tumor and not a pregnancy. Despite the world of rumors growing around her, one thing could be confirmed. Around late May 1555, Mary's belly began to shrink. Unable to explain or understand what was happening to her body, she continued to wait as those around her slowly lost hope. By August 1555, Mary finally left the confines of her chamber, childless and alone like never before. She believed that God was punishing her for failing in a mission she set out to achieve just months earlier. Protestant religion was stronger than ever in England, and all those people had died in vain. 2 years later, Mary once again was convinced that she was pregnant, but nobody around her was as enthusiastic anymore. What she considered sure signs of pregnancy was actually her body entering menopause, and soon she died at the age of 42, most likely of a uterine or ovarian cancer. After her death, Mary descended into a legacy of bloodshed and humiliation, and not without good reason. Like her sister, Elizabeth too would send hundreds to be executed. In fact, many more, and she too would have no children. Yet only Mary bore the shame for these offenses. While her sister became the gilded legend, Mary became the myth, an urban spooky story, the witch in the mirror, her arms forever outstretched and empty. Tell us in the comments if Mary deserves the title of the Bloody or not. And as always, thanks for watching Nutty History.